Cool. Which Civil War? There are multiple Civil Wars.
Oh, you want to get into this? Okay. What Civil War? I don't know. Is there, when you ask that, do you mean multiple civil wars in the United States or more, or
Well,
are you,
there are multiple Civil Wars throughout history. Civil War is an ambiguous term, but I understand what you are implying.
oh, okay, wait, but like what civil wars do you know about? Which ones do you specialize in?
Well, I not necessarily specialize. I just, I have a healthy understanding of military history stretching back 5,000 years. That may sound cocky, but it's true. You know, uh, I could just talk about the American Civil War because it's the most pertinent, I suppose.
Let me ask you this. Have civil wars affected other civil wars? Like have some people saw a civil war and decided that they want to do a civil war?
No, but, well, I don't know. That's a good question, maybe. I'd have to think about that. Oh, you could say that the collapse of Yugoslavia in the 90s was a series of interlocking civil wars, but you can also frame them as wars of independence. So that's kind of iffy. You can.
Yeah, because okay, the difference between independence is basically a country that owns, like, takes over a country.
Well, for example, Yugoslavia, for
Hmm.
example, it was, something akin to a confederation of the South Balkan states, like, Serbia and Croatia and etc. And because they're all Yugoslavs, though, when Yugoslavia, I mean, they were living under the umbrella term Yugoslavia, yeah, they had lived together. But that's a tough case to make. I mean,
I'm gonna
I don't
say,
know.
then in that case, wouldn't the Vietnam War be somewhat of a civil war, just with a lot
Oh
of
yeah,
outside help?
absolutely was a civil war. Yeah, yeah. Vietnam was fundamentally a civil war amongst the Vietnamese with, France because they had taken over Vietnam in the Tonkin Wars in the mid 1880s and they had pacified the region, that was their far eastern outpost, and then the communists show up really and they really churn the wheels of independence because when World War II came around, Japan took over French Indochina, which included, Laos, Cambodia, etc. And then the French, in the wake of World War II, because they had been occupied and they had served, Vichy as, Hitler's allies, they had the gumption to decide to commit themselves to a war across the globe, which was very stupid on their part because it revamped colonial ambitions and they didn't have the economy nor the military for it. So, yeah. And then a decade later, you see a gradual increase of American presence until 1965. You have the Marines land at Da Nang, and you get all of that happening.
What about would Korea be considered a civil war? North and South Korea?
Absolutely. Yeah, that was a Civil War too, fundamentally. Wasn't even considered a war, though, right? President Truman labeled it as a police action, and interestingly enough, peace has never been declared, so only an armistice. So the Korean War is still technically ongoing,
Yeah,
right? It's deterrence and, the U.S. Eighth Army and, the South Korean military.
and the
That is,
demilitarization zone.
yeah, 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 bubble landmine. Yeah. Uh, but well, the American Civil War is so massive. Is there a specific targeted area that you like regular army, the immigrants, field
Six
fortifications?
Succession. What about the Succession winter?
What about the what do you want?
Succession. When it
Okay,
started, yeah.
what about what about it?
Why, in your mind, did it all start? Where did it all start? Even
That's
before.
complicated. Okay, so so where did it all start? Well, okay, so the infant United States. All right, there is something of an equilibrium between mostly slaveholding states and mostly free states. But understand that our concept of a slave state is, misconstrued, right? Because we generally focus on the South. Obviously, they had a lot of slaves, way more than the North. But even the northern states, they still carried slavery well into the 19th century. I mean, it wasn't until 1846 that New Jersey finally abolished slavery.
Huh.
That's only 15 years before Fort Sumter. Isn't that staggering? That's weird, right? But um, you have this equilibrium, okay? And as you shift westward and you get more and more states included, right? One state becomes a slave, the other comes in free. All right. Now this process undergoes its first, strain in 1821 during the Missouri Compromise. So Missouri is coming in as a slave state, but there was this New York representative, I can't remember his name, who, attached who had an addendum to the bill to bring Missouri in, and he said something like Missouri. Oh yeah. He flipped the tables on him, and he said Missouri should not be allowed in as a slave state, and this totally, floored everybody's minds. And this is where you get the first of the great compromises, you know, because Southerners saw this as something of an affront, and many Northerners were like, "What the hell are you doing, dude?" So it was decided that the Missouri Compromise, okay, Maine would come in as a free state, Missouri would come in as a slave state, but below Missouri's southern border, this is where slavery will be. Right? I can't remember the latitude or longitude at the moment, but below this line, slavery. Okay? Cool beans. Missouri, however, ironically enough, is north of this line. So Missouri was a special, exception to the rule. All right? But below that line, there was slavery. North of it, there wasn't slavery. Unless you were in the border states like Maryland and Kentucky, where they already had, great, vast quantities slaves. But so this settles things for a bit. Things settle down for a bit. And then the next great strain, if you will, comes in 1842, and you get this very big Supreme Court case. And this is where the idea of states' rights, is put into effect. But, it's not Southern states' rights. It's a Northern state whose personal laws are being, not adhered to by the wide federal government. And basically, what happens in 1780, Pennsylvania begins to work towards abolishing slavery. And in 1819, they established these laws whereby it is illegal and a crime to come in and kidnap people across the border. The slave catchers were trying to do that.
Really? Kidnapping. That's not a horrible thing. Sorry. That's sarcastic.
Anyway, so they would go into Pennsylvania, and they would just take people at will. And this is, Pennsylvania ain't happy with this because a lot of escaped slaves, they have children born in Pennsylvania, naturally free. It's crime to take, free-born Pennsylvanians south into slavery, a condition they had never known. So that's a big crime. And in 1826, you get personal liberty laws where, slave catchers from Maryland, they have to come before, the judiciary of Pennsylvania in order to bring their case forward. But in this instance, it didn't work. And, a slave catcher from Maryland came north and he took this woman named Margaret Morgan and her child. Now, Margaret Morgan was an escaped slave from Maryland who had, fled more than a decade before to Pennsylvania, and she had a child there, and that child was naturally free. So, by taking them south and selling them into slavery, this naturally caused an uproar. So, Pennsylvania decided to arrest and try and convict the slave catcher. And this brought, this small instance to national attention. It was brought before the Supreme Court. What is the name of the case? It's in the units, all right? You want to read it, $5 for the website, all right? Anyway, so this Supreme Court case, okay, there's a very important opinion, which is written by Justice Story. And Justice Story, ironically enough, is from Massachusetts.
Mm-hmm.
Massachusetts is the bedrock of abolition. This is where all the lunatic abolitionists are. And yes, the abolitionists were fanatical New Englanders of Puritan stock. All right, these people were incredibly bigoted, right? But their causes were obviously justified. But here's an example of how bigoted they were. Marriott Beecher Stowe's, she wrote for Uncle Tom Cap.
Yeah.
Right? Her dad, right? He was a Protestant preacher. He once led a mob to burn down a Catholic nunnery. So
bigoted against other faiths.
Yes.
Not
especially the Catholics, right? If you were white and Catholic, if you were white, Catholic, and Irish, you had a rough time of it. Not comparing that at all to chattel slavery by any extent, but
it's good to know we've come a long way.
Yeah, 2 to 3. So anyway, Justice Story, back to him. All right. So he says, in his opinion, he goes all the way back to the Constitution. And the Constitution Constitution was full of compromises, right?
Mm-hmm.
But in the articles which deal with interstate commerce and interaction, right, there is a small little section that says, if a convict or an escaped slave, flees one state into another state, right, that state from which he has absconded is allowed to go in and, take him back and return him to his master or whatever. But, constitutional historians, they look at this and they're like, okay, this wasn't a compromise. This really wasn't anything of note. I mean, nobody in the convention really writes about it. It doesn't cause an uproar, like 3/5 did. And by the way, 3/5 compromise did not relegate, enslaved people to 3/5 of a human being. Absolutely not. It was part of the article which dictated, state population, how many representatives you're going to have, how much you're going to be taxed, how much, how many electoral college votes you're going to have. And so what it was decided is, okay, for the purposes of counting the state population, we're going to count 3/5 of all the enslaved peoples as part of our wider state population. But they weren't relegated to 3/5 of a human being, and that's myth, and it has to be busted. Anyway, so that's it, what I was saying before. And anyway, so catching slaves, right? There is no regulation as to how to do this. There is no oversight. There is no real way to enforce this law, right? Until Justice Story comes along and he recreates history. He rewrites it in his opinion. And he says, this article, excuse me, you remember the article, it's terrible. Read the units. Anyway, so he decides to say this article, this piece of the Constitution is so incredibly important, right? And it caused such a ruckus in the Constitutional Convention, which it didn't, that, the framers had to compromise on it. And they decide to have the federal government enforce these laws, right?
Mm-hmm.
He just pulled that out of his hat, out of nowhere. So Justice Story says that returning slaves to their former masters is not a matter for the states themselves, it is a matter for the federal government. And that is critically important because 8 years later, no, sorry, 12 years later, what do you get? The Fugitive Slave Law.
Oh, sorry, yes. I know that.
Fugitive Slave Law.
Read it in the website. It's there.
Yeah, so that's an important, pivot on a new dime. But at the same time, you have to understand that westward expansion, right? People want to see slavery expand. A lot of others, they don't. So this naturally causes friction. And then the war with Mexico, what do you get? Well, you get, Arizona, California, New Mexico, etc. And this yields far more new land. Slavery wants to expand, or southern slaveholders for the most part want to expand, and Congress is like, okay, well, it'll take forever to settle all that land, so we can come back to this in the future. Well, a year after the Mexican War ends, what happens? You find gold in California, and this unleashes a torrent of people westward. Suddenly, you have hundreds of thousands of people living in these new territories, and territories are popping up. So Congress is like, people with this now. And then the climactic decade of the 1850s, you have all these, babies, right? Band-aids trying to staunch the hemorrhage. Doesn't really work. So first of these, you get the Kansas-Nebraska Act, right, where popular sovereignty is the way to go. Slavery will be allowed in a new territory based on the will of the people living there, right? And this leads to bleeding Kansas, where you have two Kansases, right? You have free Kansas, you have slave Kansas, right? And what do they naturally do? They start killing one another on a mass scale, right? And it's from this bloodshed that John Brown will emerge. And John Brown was nuts, all right? This guy he was a firebrand, Old Testament style, like really fire and brimstone, right? So one time, he lived next to his neighbors in Potawatomi, Kansas, were pro-slavery, and he and his sons take them out one night and they decapitate them and disembowel them with broadswords. So that's just a flavor of who John Brown is. So he's really, it's questionable when people, uphold him as this great person because, he did some questionable things. Anyway, so he goes to Harper's Ferry, right? Launches a raid that fails miserably to secure arms, and his death helps even further kick off, the powder keg that is erupting. And then when Lincoln is elected president, right? Lincoln, I like to look at it as, okay, the South, their president didn't win, so they threw the epic temper tantrum in American history and they seceded from the Union. There you get the Civil War.
That's a good understanding of the why it all began and why it's interesting. Is there a civil war out there that was not a good idea per se?
That wasn't a good idea?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, hell yeah. Hold on. My computer's dying. So. Son of a shit. Okay. So, in the aftermath of Irish independence in the 1920s, the IRA splits between treaty and pro-treaty elements. So basically what had happened, the British come in, the IRA, fights them to a standstill. But the British government is like, okay, if you don't accept these treaty terms of ours, which makes Ireland an autonomous state, it's a free state within the British Empire, but it's still part of the British Empire. Then, if you don't accept these, we're going to send in the British Army, and we're going to unleash total and absolute war upon you, and we're going to, it's going to be bad.
Yeah.
So, Michael Collins and Arthur Griffin, who are thrown under the bus, in my honest opinion, because, even De Valera, who is the president of the Irish Republic, he is the politician. He is the one that should be negotiating. But in my view, De Valera sent those two guys over there, because he knew they wouldn't get a good deal and he didn't want to be scapegoated, So when Michael Collins, who's the architect of victory, right, he is the leader of the IRA, and Arthur Griffith, when they return to Ireland, they go to the Dáil, which is, the Irish Parliament, essentially. And they present this treaty, and it narrowly wins, in a vote in the Dáil, but half the Dáil walks out, including De Valera, and that leads to a major commencement of hostilities, which is called the Irish Civil War, between the pro-Free State forces and anti-Free State forces. So, Irish men and women who a year before had been fighting together against the British, suddenly they're shooting one another. Mike Collins is going to get assassinated, which is a great travesty. And ultimately, De Valera and his wayward forces will accept the Free State solution. And 20 years later, in the late 1940s, Ireland becomes completely independent of the British Empire. But the Irish Civil War, and by the way, in Ireland, this topic still can cause, fisticuffs to be drawn, stuff like that, is really a pointless war. It is terrible.
Now, isn't the IRA still a terrorist group out there?
Well, you have a series of branches because, so the IRA splits in the 20s, and there are units still calling themselves the IRA in the 40s and the 50s, and in the 50s they conduct what is called, the border campaign against, Northern Ireland.
Mm-hmm.
So then in the 60s, you get the creation of the Provisional IRA when the troubles in Northern Ireland kick off. So you have organizations that call themselves the old IRA, you have the Provisional IRA, you have the Irish National Liberation Army. So you have a variety of different things. But the IRA that we're referring to is that which was founded, in the aftermath of the Easter Rising of 1916, in which Michael Collins led the War of Independence from 1919 to 1921. And then after it fractures in the Civil War, that's when I personally spelled the death of the IRA, the old IRA. The provost for something different, but
Well, Conor, thank you so.
People calling themselves the IRA operating.
Yeah.
So.
Well, thanks for giving us a better understanding of civil wars, and not just our Civil War, but other civil wars as well.
Sure.
Sounds like almost every country.
A lot of editing on this video.
Sounds like a lot of countries have actually had civil wars.
Yeah, I think every nation has had a civil war. Canada, you can look at the War of 1812 because you had Canadians fighting on both sides. War of Independence, same thing. Yeah, interesting. I never thought about it. I mean, most wars of independence tend to be civil wars as well, because not everybody wants independence. When you look at the French Revolution, in the west of France, in the Vendée, you had hundreds of thousands of Catholics who despised Parisians and all that they were doing. And so in order to pacify them, the National Assembly and its follow-on, political movements sent the French Revolutionary Army into these regions of France to pacify these people and bring them over to the revolutionary ideals. You burn and destroy, and that is how you get fraternité, equality, and liberty.
Well, again,
the point of the bayonet, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you, Conor. I'll let you go. I hope you have a great week. If you have any comments or questions, add them to the comments below. Otherwise, we'll see you tomorrow, actually. Take care. Bye.